Vivienne Ashcroft smiled when she set the canceled promotion letter down in front of me, the black man who had personally rescued the 3 largest projects her company owned. She said the vice president role needed an image that fit the executive floor a little better, then told me to go back to my desk as though nothing had ever been promised. I did not argue. I gathered my plan, thanked her for her time, and walked out of the office without raising my voice once. 17 minutes later, her phone rang on the glass table behind her. Our largest client had just canceled a deal worth $90 million. If you like stories where contempt finally costs something, stay with me and watch this board turn completely over. My name is Elias Brooks. I was 42 years old that winter, and for 2 years I had been the man they called when a project started to die. Ashcroft Dynamics occupied 11 floors of a gray tower on the west side of Chicago, and I knew every failing account inside it better than the people whose names were printed on the doors. When a manufacturing client threatened to walk over a botched integration, they sent me. When a logistics account bled $40 million of contracted revenue into delay penalties, they sent me. I rebuilt the operating model, I rewrote the delivery framework, and I designed the entire deployment architecture that Sterling Meridian Group eventually agreed to buy. My title said Senior Director of Strategic Operations, which was a polite way of saying I carried executive weight on a director's badge. The irony of my working life was simple, and it repeated itself every quarter. I built the strategy, and someone else presented it. I remember sitting at the far end of the conference table, watching a regional director walk the board through slides I had written at 1 a.m, reading my own sentences back to me in a voice that made them sound like his. Vivienne would accept the compliments afterward with a small, gracious tilt of her head, and the board would tell her she had assembled a remarkable team. Nobody was lying, exactly. They simply had a habit of describing the work without describing the worker, and, after a while, that habit stops feeling accidental. Vivienne Ashcroft was 51, and she had grown up inside the company her grandfather founded, which meant she had never once had to explain why she belonged in a room. She was elegant in a way that felt engineered, precise about language, and absolutely serious about status. She was not the sort of woman who insulted anyone directly, because direct insults leave evidence. Instead, she managed the small architecture of exclusion, and she did it with a craftsmanship I could almost admire if it had not been aimed at me for so long. She would call me in at 8 at night to fix a client crisis, and then hold the client dinner 2 nights later without extending an invitation. There were dozens of those moments, and I stopped keeping count somewhere in the first year. She introduced younger directors by their full titles and then described me to visiting executives as the technical lead, which reduced 11 years of enterprise strategy into something that sounded like server maintenance. She copied me on problems and left me off announcements. Once, in a leadership session I was asked to attend but not to speak in, she said something that stayed with me for a very long time. "Elias is excellent when things need to be repaired," she told the room. "But leadership requires a different kind of presence." Nobody flinched, because the sentence was built not to make anyone flinch. It was smooth enough to pass as a compliment and sharp enough to draw a line. Everyone in that room walked out understanding the shape of it, that I was a useful mechanism rather than a candidate, a person you deploy rather than a person you promote. I did not respond that day. I went home, made dinner for my daughter Nora, who was 16, and mostly interested in whether I had remembered to buy the right kind of bread. And I sat at the kitchen table afterward reading the Sterling proposal for the 9th time. If presence was the problem, I decided, then the work would have to speak so loudly that presence became irrelevant. 3 months before the morning that changed everything, the board had made a decision that everyone treated as settled. If the Sterling Meridian engagement closed, I would become Vice President of Enterprise Transformation. It was recorded, it was discussed in the Compensation Committee, and it was mentioned in front of enough witnesses that I allowed myself to believe in it. What mattered to me was not the words on a business card. The title carried Budget Approval Authority and Hiring Authority, which meant that for the first time I would be able to execute the plan I had designed instead of begging 4 layers of management for the resources it required. That distinction is the entire engine of what followed, so let me be precise about it. Graham Sterling, the chief executive of Sterling Meridian Group, had spent 6 months evaluating 3 firms before choosing us. He had sat across from me in 9 separate working sessions, and he had asked me questions that no one at my own company had ever bothered to ask. He agreed to invest $90 million, partly because the plan named a specific governance structure, and that structure named a leader with real authority to make decisions when the program hit trouble. He was not doing me a favor. He was protecting his own money, and he had simply worked with me long enough to know who actually ran the thing. On a Monday morning in February, I opened my calendar and found a new invitation sitting at the top of the day. It was 30 minutes long. It was in Vivienne's office rather than a conference room, and the subject line contained 2 words: promotion discussion. I read it twice, then I closed my laptop and looked out at the frozen lake for a while, feeling something I had not let myself feel in 2 years, which was the beginning of relief. I walked into her office at 9:15, carrying a leather folder with the final implementation plan inside it. Because I assumed the meeting was procedural, the room smelled faintly of cut flowers, the kind that get replaced before they wilt. Vivienne was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, and she turned and told me to sit with a warmth that should have warned me. There was a single sheet of paper on the desk, face down, and she turned it over with 2 fingers and slid it toward me. It was my promotion letter, and across the top someone had stamped the word withdrawn. I read it in silence while she talked. She did not mention performance. She did not tell me a single place where I had fallen short, or point to a metric, or reference a complaint from a client or a colleague. She said the leadership team was reassessing the composition of the executive tier, and that the timing of certain appointments had been reconsidered in light of how the company wanted to be perceived by the market. It was a paragraph of upholstery wrapped around an empty room, and both of us knew it. Then she said the sentence I would repeat to a board of directors 9 days later, word for word, without any need to check my notes. You bring enormous value to this company, Elias. But value and standing are not always the same thing. She said it kindly. That was the strange part, the genuine warmth in her delivery, as though she were explaining a law of physics to a student she was fond of. She followed it by suggesting I was most effective in a supporting capacity, solving problems behind the scenes where my particular strengths were not diluted by the demands of visibility. I asked her one question, and I asked it evenly. Was this decision approved by the board? Her expression cooled by about 10 degrees, and she set her cup down with a small click that told me more than her answer did. She said the chief executive does not require board approval for every title in the organization, and that the board had delegated operate personnel matters to her office years ago. Technically, that was true for most roles. It was not true for a position that had been entered into the strategic succession plan and discussed by the Compensation Committee. But I did not correct her because I had already realized that she genuinely did not remember it being written down. She was not finished. She leaned back and told me not to turn an opportunity I had never been guaranteed into something the company owed me. That is the line I think about most, even now. Not because it was the cruelest thing she said that morning, but because it revealed exactly how she had organized the world in her mind. In her version, nothing had been taken from me, because nothing had ever been mine. The promotion was a gift she had chosen not to give, and my disappointment was therefore a kind of ingratitude. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten to resign, which is what she was braced for, and I could see her waiting for it in the set of her shoulders. Instead, I asked one final question, and it was the only one that actually mattered. Has Sterling Meridian been informed about the change to the governance structure? She laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind people make when a child says something charmingly beside the point. Clients purchase services from Ashcroft Dynamics, she told me. They do not purchase an employee. Sitting there, I understood that she had never read the deal she was about to close. Not really read it, not the annexes, not the section that mattered. Sterling Meridian had not bought a logo or a methodology or a rate card. They had bought a plan with a named accountable executive holding defined approval rights, because their own board had insisted on it after a previous vendor collapsed under exactly this kind of ambiguity. I could have explained all of that in 90 seconds. I opened my mouth to do it, and then I looked at her face and understood that she would hear it as a threat from a man negotiating for a title. So I closed the folder instead. I said 3 words, "I understand now." She smiled, satisfied, because she thought she had just managed a difficult conversation with grace. As I stood to leave, she added one more thing, and this was the layer of contempt I found genuinely remarkable. "And Elias," she said, "do not let this affect the Sterling meeting this afternoon." She had taken the authority out of my hands at 9:30, and by 9:32 she was asking me to guarantee her a $90 million contract with the same hands. I went back to my floor. There was no scene, no slammed door, no dramatic packing of a cardboard box, because that is not who I am, and because none of it would have accomplished anything. I answered 11 emails and reviewed a resourcing model. At 11, I called Nora, who had a chemistry test that afternoon and wanted to know whether she could stay at a friend's house to study, and I told her yes. Then I went to the 11:30 operations review and presented the same material I would have presented on any other Monday of my life. I have since learned that my calm confirmed something for Vivienne. She told her chief of staff that afternoon that she had been concerned about my reaction and that my professionalism proved I understood my position. What she meant, translated, was that she believed I was too dependent on the job to push back. Men with mortgages and teenage daughters and no family money do not blow up their careers over titles. That arithmetic was completely correct, and it was also completely irrelevant, because I was never going to be the one who blew anything up. Julian Cross found me by the elevators a little after noon. He was the chief financial officer, 47. A careful man who had spent his career learning exactly how much truth a room could absorb. He asked whether the morning meeting had gone the way I hoped, in the overly casual tone people use when they already suspect the answer. I told him the plain version. Promotion was canceled. He stopped walking. He actually stopped in the middle of the corridor, with his hand halfway to the elevator button, and he stood there for 4 or 5 seconds without saying anything at all. Julian understood immediately what Vivienne had overlooked, because he had signed the financial annexes himself. Inside the Sterling Meridian agreement, past the pricing tables and the service levels, there was a section titled Executive Governance Structure. It identified the accountable program executive by name and by role. It stated that this executive would hold budget authority, escalation authority, and the right to redeploy resources without secondary approval. My name was in that section, followed by the words Vice President Designate, because everyone involved had expected the appointment to be effective before the launch phase began. Sterling had not agreed to a general promise of good service. Their own governance committee had required a named accountable officer with defined power because 2 years earlier a different vendor had told them the same reassuring things and then buried their program under an approval chain nobody could locate. Graham Sterling had learned an expensive lesson. and he had written that lesson into the contract in language his lawyers could enforce. Julian knew all of this. He also knew that the final signature package was scheduled for that same week. I want to be very clear about what I did next because it is the part people find hardest to believe. I did not call Graham Sterling. I did not email him, text him, hint to him, or arrange for anyone else to do it on my behalf. I had his direct line in my phone, and I never touched it. Partly that was integrity, and partly it was simple self-preservation, because I already knew that the moment the deal went sideways, I would be the first person accused. But mostly it was this: the truth about that contract did not require my help to surface. It only required that someone stop hiding it. At 2:40 that afternoon, Sterling Meridian's contracts office sent a routine request. They asked Ashcroft Dynamics to confirm the executive leadership roster for the governance annex before the final signature block was executed. It was a compliance step, the kind of thing that gets handled by a paralegal on a normal week. Julian brought it to Vivienne's office because he already knew there was nothing normal about it. She read it, and she told him to send the existing version. Julian refused. I was not in the room, but 3 people described the moment to me afterward in almost identical words, which is how I know it happened the way I am telling it. He said that I was no longer the vice president designate, and that he could not certify a governance structure he knew to be inaccurate. Vivienne told him the distinction was administrative. Julian told her the distinction was a representation to a counterparty in a document she was asking him to sign his name to. That was the first crack, and it came not from anger but from a chief financial officer's absolute unwillingness to attest to a fact he knew was false. Naomi Pierce came up from legal 20 minutes later. She was 39, the general counsel, and the most neutral human being I have ever worked with, a woman who treated every situation as a set of exposures to be measured rather than a drama to be joined. She told Vivienne that transmitting a governance structure containing a role that had been internally revoked days before execution created a material misrepresentation risk. She said it flatly, without a trace of judgment, and she recommended that the roster be corrected before it left the building. Vivienne argued for 11 minutes. Naomi did not move. At 4:12, the corrected roster went to Sterling Meridian. My name was removed from the executive authority line and reassigned to a delivery support designation 2 levels down. The accountable executive field listed a regional vice president who had never attended a single working session with the client and who, to my knowledge, had never read the implementation plan past the summary. I know the exact minute because Naomi copied me on the transmittal as a matter of routine practice, and I remember reading my own demotion in a footnote while eating a sandwich at my desk. 17 minutes later, Graham Sterling's office requested an immediate call with the chief executive of Ashcroft Dynamics. Vivienne walked into the glass conference room at 5:10 with genuine confidence. I have thought about that a great deal because it was not performance. She truly believed she was about to manage a minor client irritation, and she brought only her chief of staff and Julian, who had asked to attend. I was not present, and I was not invited, which meant I spent that hour at my desk finishing a resourcing model that would be irrelevant by morning. Everything I know about the next 40 minutes came from Julian, from Naomi, and eventually from a transcript, because Sterling Meridian recorded the call with notice, the way disciplined companies do. Graham appeared on the screen with his general counsel on his left and his chief operating officer on his right. That configuration was itself a message, and Vivienne missed it entirely. She opened warmly. She said she wanted to address what she understood to be a small question about internal staffing, and she assured him that the firm's commitment to the program was unchanged and that the depth of the Ashcroft bench meant no single individual was ever a point of failure. It would have worked on almost any other client. Graham let her finish. Then he asked one question. Will Elias Brooks hold approval authority over program resources? Vivienne answered for close to a minute without answering, describing an integrated leadership model and a collaborative escalation framework. Graham waited, and then he asked the identical question again, using the identical words, which is a technique I have only seen used by people who have already made a decision and are simply establishing a record. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then Vivienne said no. Graham explained himself carefully, and I have read that section of the transcript more times than I will admit. Sterling Meridian had spent 6 months evaluating 3 firms. They had not placed $90 million on the Ashcroft Dynamics logo, or on a methodology, or on a promise of general excellence. They had placed it on a specific plan, with a specific governance structure, built and owned by a specific person, and their board had approved the investment on the strength of that structure. He said the plan and the authority behind it were not separable items. Removing one changed the nature of what they had agreed to buy. Vivienne made her worst decision of the entire affair right there. Rather than asking what would restore his confidence, she tried to reduce me. "Mr. Brooks remains a valued member of my team," she said, "but he is a member of my team." Julian told me the room went strange after that. The particular stillness of people watching someone step off a ledge in slow motion. Graham was silent for several seconds. Then he said 5 words. "That is precisely the problem." Sterling Meridian invoked the material personnel change provision in the pre-execution agreement and canceled the $90 million transaction before the implementation phase began. There was no negotiation. There was no demand, no ultimatum, no offer to reconsider if a title were restored by Friday. Graham did not give Vivienne the opportunity she was hoping for, which was to keep using me while continuing to deny me any standing. He simply withdrew, cleanly, in the way that only a client who has already decided you are a governance risk can withdraw. Vivienne asked him, and I think this was the first genuinely unguarded thing she said all day, whether he was truly walking away from $90 million over a job title. Graham's answer took 11 seconds and it ended the meeting. "No," he said, "I am walking away because you have just told me that the person who understands this program best has no authority to decide anything within it." Then he thanked everyone for their time, and the screen went dark, and Julian said the only sound in the room was the air handler. By 6:30 that evening, the loss had a shape and a number, and by 7 it had a search for someone to blame. I was still in the building because I had a delivery review at 8 the next morning, and I do not walk out on work I have committed to, even on the worst day of a bad year. At 7:20, my phone buzzed with a meeting invitation for 8:15 the following day, and this one had 4 other attendees: the chief financial officer, the general counsel, the head of human resources, and Vivienne. I walked into that conference room understanding exactly what it was. Vivienne did not begin with the loss. She began with a theory. She had convinced herself, somewhere between 5 and midnight, that I had called Graham Sterling the moment I left her office and detonated the deal out of wounded pride. It was the only version of events that let her remain the protagonist of a story about betrayal, rather than the author of a story about a bad decision. She asked me directly, in front of 3 witnesses, what I had said to Sterling. "Nothing," I told her. "Not a word." She did not believe me, and she said so, and then she made an accusation with human resources, sitting 8 feet away taking notes. She said I had deliberately sabotaged a strategic contract in retaliation for a personnel decision, and that such conduct would be grounds for immediate termination and potential legal action. I let her finish. Then I asked the head of human resources to have information technology pull my complete communication record, phone logs, email, messaging, calendar, and building access, for the entire period from 9:15 the previous morning forward. I asked for it in writing, and I asked that Naomi supervise it, and I said I would waive any objection to the scope. That is not a request a guilty man makes. It took information technology 50 minutes. There was no call to Sterling Meridian, no email, no message, no meeting, no forwarded document, no contact of any kind with anyone at that organization or any intermediary connected to it. My last communication with the client had been a project status note sent 4 days earlier, which Julian had reviewed and approved before it went out. The room was very quiet when Naomi read the summary aloud. I remember watching Vivienne's hands. She still did not stop. She said that a client's personal fondness for an individual did not make that individual more important than the institution, and she told me not to confuse being liked with being essential. I answered her honestly, because it was true. I have never thought that, I said. I have never once believed I was more important than this company. What I believed was that the company had made a commitment in a contract, and that someone was going to have to explain to the client why it changed. Then Julian said the sentence that moved the ground under her. But it appears the client believes your decision made this company a risk. He said it quietly, without heat, looking at the table rather than at her. It was the first time a senior executive at Ashcroft Dynamics had contradicted Vivienne Ashcroft in front of other people, and everyone in the room registered the size of it. Naomi did not defend her. Human resources did not defend her. The silence that followed was a kind of vote. Vivienne recovered by changing the subject to the only thing she still wanted, which was the money. She asked me to save the contract, not to advise on saving it, not to help prepare a response, but to personally call Graham Sterling and bring the $90 million back. She did not restore my appointment. She did not apologize. She did not so much as acknowledge that the two events might be connected in the mind of the man she wanted me to call. She simply moved from accusing me of destroying it to requiring me to repair it in the same conversation, without a pause for breath. I said yes and no in the same answer, and it was the first boundary I had drawn in 2 years. I told her I would support the company fully. I would rebuild the plan, prepare the analysis, brief anyone she designated, and sit in any meeting she wanted me in. Then I said the part that mattered. But I will not tell a client that I hold authority you have just decided I do not deserve to hold. I am willing to work. I am not willing to lie on your behalf to a man who trusts me. She stared at me for a long moment, and I think she finally understood that the leverage she had assumed she held over me did not exist in the shape she imagined. She dismissed the meeting. I went back to my desk and started rebuilding the implementation model from the second phase forward. Because whatever happened to my career, 400 people were attached to that program, and somebody had to do the arithmetic. The loss of a $90 million contract does not stay inside a company. By Wednesday morning, the board of directors had it, and Vivienne had prepared her framing carefully. Her memorandum described an emotional client reaction to a routine internal staffing adjustment, and it characterized Sterling Meridian's decision as an unfortunate overcorrection by a counterparty with an unusually personal attachment to a mid-level manager. It was a well-written document. It might even have worked if Naomi Pierce had not already found something considerably worse than a bad personnel decision. Naomi had done what general counsels do when a company loses a strategic client 3 days before signature, which is to reconstruct the entire record. She pulled the compensation committee minutes from 3 months earlier and found my appointment recorded there, not as a possibility, but as an approved element of the strategic succession plan, contingent only on the closing of the Sterling engagement. Then she pulled the diligence package that had been provided to Sterling Meridian's governance committee. My appointment appeared in that document too, inside the key personnel and organizational risk section, as a mitigating control the client had specifically requested. That changed the entire character of the situation, and Naomi understood it instantly. Vivienne had not merely made a questionable judgment about a promotion. She had unilaterally reversed a documented element of the strategic plan approved by a committee of the board, hours before the closing of the largest contract in company history. And she had not informed a single director. The board had learned about it from the client's cancellation notice. Directors will forgive an executive a great deal, including expensive mistakes, but they do not forgive being the last people in the room to know. The Thursday session ran 3 hours. I was not in it, but Naomi later walked me through the parts that concerned me, because I was entitled to know what had been said about me. The chairman, a retired industrial chief executive named Walter Hensley, who had sat on that board for 19 years, asked Vivienne one question and then asked it 4 more times in different forms. Why? Why was the appointment reversed? Not who decided, not when, not how it was communicated. Simply why. Vivienne answered with vocabulary. She spoke about executive presence. She spoke about cultural fit and client-facing image and leadership polish, and the need for the executive tier to reflect the company's positioning in a competitive market. She used those phrases 11 times between them, and Naomi wrote each one down. What Vivienne never produced, across 3 hours, was a single performance indicator, a single client complaint, a single peer assessment, a single missed commitment, or a single documented incident, suggesting I was not capable of the role the board had already approved me for. The internal data, when the board asked for it, went the other direction so hard that it became uncomfortable. Programs under my direction had the highest client retention rate in the firm, 94% against a company average of 71. All 3 of the distressed accounts I had been assigned to had recovered and renewed. Sterling Meridian had sent an unsolicited letter of commendation naming me specifically, which had been filed and never shown to me. And for 11 months I had been carrying the operational responsibilities of the vice president role without the title, the compensation, or the authority, a fact that appeared in my own performance review as evidence of my value. Somewhere in the 2nd hour, Naomi told me, the conversation quietly inverted. Vivienne had walked into that room believing she was being asked to justify her assessment of me. What was actually happening was that the board was assessing her decision, and every sentence she offered in her own defense described a standard that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with how a person looked standing next to her. Walter Hensley said very little in the 3rd hour. At the end of the session, he asked that I be made available the following morning at 8 in a special meeting of the board, without the chief executive present. I did not sleep much that night. Nora made pasta because I clearly was not going to, and she asked me whether I was in trouble, and I told her the truth, which was that I did not know but that I had not done anything wrong. She said okay in the way 16-year-olds do when they have decided to believe you, and afterward I sat with a legal pad and wrote down facts. Not arguments, not grievances. Facts, in chronological order, each one attached to a document or a witness. Because I understood something about the room I was walking into. I had exactly one opportunity, and the fastest way to lose it was to sound like a man with a wound. 8 directors were seated when I came in, and there was a chair at the near end of the table, with a folder in front of it. Walter Hensley thanked me for coming, and then asked the question I had been dreading since the invitation arrived. Mr. Brooks, do you believe Vivienne Ashcroft holds a prejudice against you? I sat with it for a moment. I could feel how badly some part of me wanted to answer that question, and I could also feel exactly how that answer would land in a room of 8 fiduciaries who had known Vivienne for a decade and had known me for 9 minutes. So I told them I would give them what I could actually testify to. I said I had been asked to build the enterprise strategy for 4 consecutive years and had presented it to the board twice, both times as a supporting participant. I said I had been assigned 3 failing accounts, had recovered all 3, and had watched other people receive the recognition in leadership communications. I said I had been given the operating responsibilities of an executive without the title or the authority, and had accepted that, because the work needed doing. Then I said the part that mattered legally, and I said it slowly. 3 months ago, I was given a set of specific milestones, in writing, with a stated outcome. Sterling engagement closed by the first quarter, delivery model approved, governance framework accepted by the client. I completed every milestone, including 2 ahead of schedule, and the client accepted the framework without a single revision. 9 days ago, with all conditions met, the decision was reversed in a meeting where no performance concern was raised and no board approval was mentioned. Walter Hensley asked me again whether I thought it was about race, and I gave him the only honest answer I had, which was not the answer either of us expected. I cannot tell you what Mrs. Ashcroft thinks about me, I said. I have never been inside her head, and I am not going to guess in front of a board of directors. What I can tell you is that the work I was permitted to do was always larger than the position she believed I deserved to hold. That is the only thing I can prove, and I think it is the only thing that matters here. Nobody said anything for a while. I have replayed that silence many times, and I believe it landed harder than any accusation would have, because I had handed them a factual asymmetry instead of an emotion to evaluate. They could argue with a claim about prejudice. They could not argue with 11 months of executive duties on a director's title, documented in their own files, signed by their own chief executive. One director, a woman named Corinne Vaugh, who ran a private equity practice, wrote something down and underlined it twice. Then the second reversal arrived, and it arrived from outside the building. At 9:40 that morning, while I was still in the room, Walter Hensley's assistant brought in a letter that had come directly from Graham Sterling to the board chairman. It was 1 page. It stated, unprompted, that Elias Brooks had at no point requested, suggested, encouraged, or been consulted about Sterling Meridian's decision to withdraw, and that any suggestion otherwise was inaccurate and unwelcome. He wrote that Sterling had withdrawn because it had lost confidence in the governance of Ashcroft Dynamics, which is a different and far more serious sentence. The letter contained one more paragraph, and that paragraph is what ended Vivienne Ashcroft's career. Graham wrote that during a dinner in November, some 7 weeks before the withdrawal, Vivienne had personally assured him of something in the presence of his chief operating officer. Elias will have executive authority once we launch. She had said it to close his confidence. She had used my pending appointment as an instrument of persuasion with the client, secured the agreement on the strength of it, and then quietly withdrawn the appointment days before execution without telling him or the board. I watched 8 faces change at the same time. Up to that moment, the worst available interpretation was a poor personnel judgment with expensive consequences, the kind of thing a board manages with a reprimand and a new process. What sat on the table now was a chief executive who had made a representation to a counterparty about the company's leadership structure, used it to secure a $90 million commitment, reversed it unilaterally, concealed the reversal from her board, and then instructed her chief financial officer to transmit the outdated structure anyway. That is not a taste question. That is a governance failure with a paper trail. Vivienne asked to see me alone that afternoon, not in her office. She chose the small room on the 12th floor with no glass wall, which told me she already understood her position better than she was going to admit. Her manner had changed completely. She was warm, almost confiding, and she began by saying that the past week had been difficult for everyone and that she wanted to find a constructive path forward. I have negotiated with enough executives to recognize a person who has stopped defending a position and started buying time. She had an offer prepared, on paper, and she slid it across the table the way she had slid the withdrawn letter 9 days earlier, which I doubt she noticed. A 22% increase in base compensation. a special retention bonus of $140,000, payable in 2 installments, a new title, Senior Director of Enterprise Programs, with a corner office on 11, expanded staff, a direct reporting line to her rather than through the operations chain. It was, in pure financial terms, the best offer I had ever been handed. In exchange, I would call Graham Sterling personally and bring the $90 million back to the table. And I would remain, in every document that mattered, not a vice president. No budget authority, no hiring authority, no executive governance role. The entire structure the client had canceled the contract over would remain exactly as she had rewritten it, and I would be paid handsomely to stand in front of that structure and tell a man I respected that it was fine. She had not understood a single thing. I told her I appreciated the effort involved in preparing it, because that was true. Then I said that money had never been the issue, and I watched her fail to process the sentence. She tried twice more, adding an accelerated equity vesting schedule the second time, as though the problem were the size of the number. And then she said the thing that I will carry for the rest of my life, in a voice that was almost gentle. "You are raising a child by yourself, Elias. Don't turn your pride into a bad financial decision." That was the floor. Not the withdrawn letter, not the accusation in front of human resources, not being described as a member of her team to a client who had built a $90 million governance structure around my judgment. This, she reached for my daughter and for the fact that I did not have another income behind me, and she used it as an argument that I was not in a position to refuse her. She said it as advice. She meant it as arithmetic. She was telling me she had calculated the price of my dignity and found it affordable. I did not raise my voice, though I want to be clear that I wanted to. I thought about Nora at the kitchen table asking whether I was in trouble, and about what I would actually want her to know about this hour if she ever asked me. Then I pushed the folder back across the table with 2 fingers. "You are still trying to purchase a vice president's work with an employee's title," I said. "That has been the arrangement for 2 years. The only thing that changed is that a client finally noticed." She dropped the warmth then. She told me that if the board could not recover the Sterling engagement, the consequences would extend well beyond the 2 of us. 400 people staffed to that program. A hiring freeze. Possible reductions across 3 service lines. She said that I would have to live with knowing I could have prevented it, and she said it with the confidence of someone who has successfully used that sentence before. I understood that this was her last instrument, and that she was aiming it at the part of me that actually did care about those 400 people. "Then you should start by telling them who made the decision," I said. "There is nothing else I can offer you. I will rebuild the plan. I will sit in any room you send me to. I will not misrepresent my own authority to a client, and I will not accept a payment for pretending the last 9 days did not happen." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face closed, and I think that was the moment she stopped believing she was going to survive this. I picked up my folder and left her sitting in a room with no windows. The board convened again on Monday, and this is the part where a certain kind of story would have security escorting a chief executive out of the building in 30 seconds. That is not what happens in real companies with real directors and real disclosure obligations, and it is not what happened at Ashcroft Dynamics. What happened was slower and, I think, more serious. The board placed Vivienne Ashcroft on administrative leave pending a formal governance review, effective immediately, and removed her from any role in the Sterling matter. The resolution listed 4 findings, and Naomi read them into the record: that the chief executive had reversed a documented element of the board-approved strategic personnel plan without notice to the board, that the reversal had directly caused the loss of the company's largest strategic client, that a divergence had been created between the leadership structure represented to a counterparty in diligence materials and the structure held internally, and that no documented performance basis had been produced for the reversal of an appointment the board itself had approved. 4 sentences. No adjectives. That is how these things actually end. I was appointed interim vice president of enterprise transformation the same afternoon, with the permanent appointment to be brought to a formal vote at the regular quarterly meeting. Walter Hensley told me plainly that interim meant interim and that I would be evaluated like anyone else. I told him that was the only version I wanted. I did not become chief executive. I did not receive a windfall, and nobody handed me a speech about justice. I received budget authority, hiring authority, and a governance role, which is precisely and only what I had been promised 11 months earlier. Sterling Meridian did not apologize and throw the money back on the table either, and I would have distrusted them if they had. Graham requested a new meeting, and his opening position was that Sterling was prepared to reopen negotiations, not to reinstate a canceled agreement. He said his board would require evidence that the governance failure had been remediated structurally rather than personally, because replacing one executive does not fix a company that allowed the situation to occur. That was fair. It was also considerably harder than begging would have been. I did not beg. I walked them through the entire plan again over 2 sessions and 11 hours. And I did something Vivienne would never have permitted, which was to open the weak points myself. I showed them where our resourcing assumptions were optimistic. I showed them the 2 integration dependencies that had no contingency. Then I proposed a joint governance board with Sterling holding independent escalation rights and quarterly access to program financials, which meant permanently reducing my own company's discretion in exchange for a client's confidence. Julian supported it. Naomi wrote it. And on a gray Thursday in March, for the first time in 14 years, I sat at the head of the table in a room where the authority I held matched the work I had been doing all along. Nobody remarked on it. That is what I remember most clearly about that morning, that the thing I had been told I lacked the presence for turned out to require no presence at all, only the plain competence I had brought into the building every day for 2 years. 6 weeks later, Sterling Meridian executed a restructured agreement. The value came in slightly below the original figure because the joint governance provisions carried real cost, and I want to be honest about that rather than inflate it into something triumphant. The number was never the point. On the executive lead line of the governance annex, in the section that had caused a $90 million contract to die on a Tuesday afternoon in February, there was a name and a title: Elias Brooks, Vice President, Enterprise Transformation. Vivienne Ashcroft left the chief executive's office in April after the governance review concluded that confidence in her leadership had been materially and irreparably damaged. The announcement used the language these announcements always use about a decision to step down and pursue other interests, and the market moved less than 1%. There was no confrontation. I never said a cutting word to her, and I never wanted to, because the only satisfying part of the whole affair was watching a set of facts finish arriving at their destination without my help. I saw her once more. She was carrying a box down the 11th floor corridor on a Friday afternoon, and I was walking the other way toward the executive conference room, the same room where she had once seated me at the far end of the table so that a regional director could read my slides aloud. We stopped for perhaps 2 seconds. She looked at the door I was heading toward, and then at me, and I saw her arrive at the arithmetic. I nodded politely the way you nod at anyone in a hallway. Then I kept walking because I had a meeting. That night I got home at 7:40 with takeout because I had genuinely forgotten how to cook that week. Nora was on the couch with her chemistry notes and a highlighter, and she looked up at me over the top of them with the specific suspicion of a teenager who has been monitoring a situation for a month without being told anything. "So," she said, "did you get the promotion?" I set the bags down on the counter and thought about how to answer a question that had taken 9 days and 2 boards of directors to resolve. "Yeah," I told her. This time, they put it in writing. She said good and went back to her notes and asked if I had gotten the dumplings with the sauce, which is exactly the correct amount of weight for a 16-year-old to give her father's career. I stood in my own kitchen for a minute, listening to her highlighter squeak. I had spent 2 years believing that if I did the work well enough, someone would eventually see it. That was wrong. The work was always visible. What changed was that it finally sat somewhere the company could not take credit for without also granting the authority. The next morning I walked into the executive conference room at 7:50, 10 minutes early, with a folder under my arm. Nobody had given me a chance, and I have never once described it that way. What happened was that a company was eventually forced to admit in writing what a client 3 states away had understood for 6 months, which is that the most valuable person in the room is not always the one with the largest title. I sat down at the head of the table, opened the folder, and got to work.